For many years, UUSC has used the occasion of our Human Rights Celebration to tell a story of impact in human rights by honoring someone who is creating real change in our world. Honorees in past years have included Rinku Sen, John Lewis, and Linda Sarsour. This year, we are thrilled to recognize the Honorable Ayanna Pressley with the UUSC Human Rights Award. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is an activist, a legislator, a survivor, and the first woman of color to be elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Throughout her career as a public servant, Congresswoman Pressley has fought to ensure that those closest to the pain are closest to the power, driving and informing policymaking. Throughout her first term in Congress, she has been a champion for justice, reproductive justice, justice for immigrants, consumer justice, justice for aging Americans, for workers, for survivors of sexual violence, and justice for the formerly and currently incarcerated. Currently, Congresswoman Pressley serves on two powerful congressional committees, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and the House Committee on Financial Services, both of which have remained focused on legislatively addressing issues of care, concern, and consequence to the American people. Prior to being elected Congress, she served on the Boston City Council for 8 years and was the first woman of color elected to the council in its 100-year history. It's been a true delight preparing for tonight's conversation. At UUSC, we have applauded, uplifted, and advocated for many of the Congresswoman's initiatives. Her leadership is bold, passionate, and clear. She calls policy her love language. And in her acceptance address, she made clear her vision when she said, "The future belongs to all of us." We are so thrilled to welcome the Congresswoman tonight. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us this evening. We are honored to have you, and I so look forward to hearing from you about your important work. I'd like to start with some personal questions.
Yeah.
I've heard you speak about the influence that your mother has had on your life. I'm curious, who else has helped shape you into the leader that you are today?
You know, being raised in a single parented household, being an only child, so it was often felt as if it was my mother and I versus the world, and her being a justice seeker in her own right as a tenants' rights activist, a community organizer, builder, super voter, and the fact that she didn't read me traditional bedtime stories, she read me the speeches of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm, right? So she remains, you know, the most formidable and enduring influence in my life. May she rest in peace and power. But my father also has influenced me in formidable ways. You know, due to the criminalization of substance use disorder, my father cycled in and out of the criminal legal system. While he was incarcerated, he was still parenting, sending me books from the Harlem Renaissance and poetry. And so that's where my love for Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, that was all informed by my father's influences. And then finally, my grandfather. He was the pastor of a small storefront church on the south side of Chicago, and that has informed everything for me. I mean, really, my faith foundation. It's also where I began to, in hearing people come every Sunday to testify, to appreciate the power of storytelling, of lived experience, which is something that I seek to center in my work every day. So, you know, I would cite those three: my mother, my father, and my grandfather.
So I love how you talk about policy as your love language. And I'd love to touch on a couple of different areas of policy in this conversation. But first of all, my question is that it feels like right now that the system was built for so much oppression and in ways that create so much harm, in particular for people of color. And so it seems to me that so much of our energy is around dismantling rather than creating. And so I wonder how you think about this process of creating policy in the context we're in. And I'd love you to talk about the way you think of it as your love language.
Sure. Well, the reason why I say policy is my love language is because the inequities and disparities, the disparate outcomes across every issue in the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, where in a 3-mile radius from Cambridge to Roxbury, life expectancy drops by 30 years, median household income by $50,000. These inequities and disparities, racial injustices that persist in the Massachusetts 7th and throughout the globe are not naturally occurring. These were the consequence and the outcomes of budget choices and of policy choices. And so if the hurt and harm was very precisely legislated, then I do believe that we can legislate equity, that we can legislate healing, that we can legislate justice. And so I say policy is my love language because it is the policies that have created great hurt and harm. And so that's the work that I seek to do now as a legislator, to actively dismantle and to replace systems of oppression with systems and policies which advance liberation, to replace systems and policies that have fostered and created trauma and hurt with systems that foster and support healing. Any bill that I write, any bill that I co-sponsor, any vote that I cast is directly informed by those closest to the pain. When I was growing up, living in the residual aftermath of redlining, the war on drugs, I didn't always appreciate it. It was sort of like, why are things so hard? And I didn't understand that these conditions had been created by policy. There were well-meaning people crafting policy that was short-sighted because they were not actively enlisting or being led by the people closest to that issue who are experiencing it every day. I was only 20 years old, and I was so struck by the power that I had with the weight of this congressional office to pick up the phone and stop someone's home from being foreclosed on, or to prevent an eviction, to connect someone to a food pantry who was struggling with food insecurity or hunger, to keep someone's utilities on who had been met with economic hardship. So I was really struck by the difference that good government can make, but I was also really struck by just how many people were not being heard. And that's why I stopped saying that I want to be a voice for the voiceless, because the truth of the matter is no one is voiceless. What they are is unheard. And so it's incumbent upon us to create space for more voices to be heard, and then for those voices to be centered in the work of lawmaking so that the legislation is responsive. It is responsive because the people who are most impacted by that, we have enlisted as our co-authors. I like to call it cooperative governing.
Let's talk for a minute about immigration. I'd like to talk a little about immigration, maybe a little about climate justice.
Okay.
In immigration, is it possible that we can abolish ICE? And if abolishing ICE isn't possible, what can we do to prevent the dramatic harm that's happening still, even with the change in administration?
So I was spending time with a young girl, and she is a DACA recipient, a dreamer, as they're characterized. And she's in a mixed immigration status household. Her father is an asylum seeker. Her mother is a TPS holder. And she said, but why am I the only one that is called a dreamer? My parents have dreams too. And so often in this country, when it comes to our immigrant neighbors, their labor has been valued, but their lives have not. Their humanity, their dignity, their dreams have not been centered. It is a heavy, heavy burden to have your very existence criminalized. Just simply how you show up in the world. Much of our foreign policy has created the situation in Central America, and so people are fleeing situations of poverty, of war, of violence, of deprivation.
And corruption.
Mm-hmm. And they should not be criminalized for that. So we have got to develop a permanent path to citizenship. And I think while people are here, they should be settled in community, not in detention. I remember having this debate in Congress with some colleagues, and I said, listen, you want to make the cage nicer. I don't want anyone in a cage. No child, no human should be in a cage. I have to try to contain myself now as I think about it, going to the southern border. I do not speak Spanish, but I didn't have to. I didn't have to be moved by and to understand the wails, the ache for their children for whom they had no idea where they were. From these women who fell into my arms in these deplorable, inhumane conditions. So yes, I do believe that we should be abolishing ICE because it contributes to a punitive carceral state that criminalizes people simply for how they show up in the world. To be Black, brown, to be minoritized, to be marginalized, and that must change. So we have to legislate our values, the ones that we espouse but struggle to practice. We have to center the humanity and the dignity of all people. And we have to pass legislation like my New Way Forward bill, which seeks to actively disrupt that detention to deportation pipeline. And we have to pass the Dream and Promise Act. And like that young girl so wisely affirmed to me, everyone has dreams.
I love how intersectionality is becoming commonly understood and seen, and how devastating that it is so clear how interconnected the oppressions are and the harm that's being done.
Yes.
I believe it's helping, correct me if you think I'm wrong, a real resurgence and energy in the movement and in movements. And correspondingly, it feels like there is a reaction to that in the criminalization of resistance. We're seeing in so many states around the country, and indeed around the world, this trend to criminalizing resistance. It's so deeply troubling. But how can we respond when any kind of protest is deemed inappropriate, illegal even?
Well, I'm not sure that any form of protest is being criminalized. Protest by specific people is being criminalized. Just 2 days ago, I was reprimanding, maybe that's too harsh a word, but I was calling out the hypocrisy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's reprimand.
Okay. I was calling out the hypocrisy of a colleague because many of my, and I don't want to make this a partisan discussion in any way, but I do have colleagues who are very quick to quote Martin Luther King Jr., but they sanitize Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, he was pacifist and nonviolent, and he was radical. I mean, Jesus was radical, right? So Dr. King was the original architect, so far as I'm concerned, of the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the original architects. And that's why we were deserving of equal rights and equal protection. He was protesting what he characterized as the three evils: poverty, militarism, racism. I said the other day, if you're tired of us saying it, if it feels like sloganeering to you, imagine how tired we are of saying it. And that we have to. And the long line of people who have lost their lives, and I said that to my colleague, I said, and by the way, Dr. King was protesting and was nonviolent in his approach, and he was murdered for affirming that Black Lives Matter. So whenever they are critical of the most recent architects of this chapter of our civil rights history, who ushered in the Black Lives Matter movement, I say, well, then you would not have liked King.
The rise of far-right extremism around the world and in our own country is deeply alarming to so many of us. Our partners in Burma shared with us that before the military coup, the rhetoric was all tied to Trump's claims of election fraud. And it's so devastating to see the impact of that military coup on so many people in Burma, but likewise here in the United States. The impact of white supremacy and these movements of hate, and the impact on you and your colleagues from January 6th. And I wonder if you have reflections about that experience and how leadership is responding and how we can move forward in a different way.
Yeah. So, January 6th, certainly it was a traumatic day. I was in my office with my husband and my chief of staff at one point, on the ground, in the dark, our doors barricaded with water bottles and chairs. But, what I find very hard is that it took an insurrection, an attempt to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power, that it took a violent mob of white supremacists seizing the Capitol for many to appreciate for the first time the threat that it is to everyone and the threat that it is to our democracy. One of the most haunting images of that day for me is the majority Black custodial staff cleaning up the mess of this violent white supremacist mob so that we could continue our duties and ratify, the Electoral College. So white supremacy is a threat to the world. It is a threat to our democracy. It is a threat to life. People see what happened on January 6th, and they're disturbed by it, and they're frightened by it. But they don't appreciate that systemic and structural racism is the cousin of white supremacy. So we have to actively dismantle it, and that means being actively anti-racist. So when people say to me, do you mean we need race-conscious laws? Yes, I do mean that. You know why? Because redlining, voter suppression, the hurt and harm that was caused, the oppression was very precise. It was very race-conscious. Look, I grew up in an activist household, so I believe in the power of the people. I believe in the power of movements. I believe in that adage we often say when we are organizing, that the power of the people has always been greater than the people in power. Mm-hmm. And maybe that seems odd that I would say that because I'm an office holder. However, I know where the power lies. And I'd like to think that because I do recognize that, that is why I do have this humbling honor of serving in this role. This last election, we saw the most marginalized mobilize, meet the moment, and make it possible for democracy to breathe another day. Black, brown, AAPI, indigenous, disabled, queer, young people. That's probably the only positive thing that came out of the last 4 years, is that our organizing silos have broken down, and we are being more inclusive, more intersectional, having that understanding that truly our destinies are tied.
The future belongs to all of us. I appreciate your saying that from the beginning after your election. And the systemic racism that you're describing and its impact, it feels like what's next is we have to get smart about reparations. Where are you seeing creative and effective approaches to reparations to build toward that future that you so clearly believe in?
I support reparations, but I also think it's about every single policy, right? So if you talk about police brutality, I don't want anyone to think that by our advancing one bill, that we will undo centuries of harm, because that's not real. We're going to have to demonstrate the political will, the courage, and the stamina to advance multiple pieces of legislation to undo centuries of harm, because it was layered, multiple, precise policies that created it. So no one bill is going to undo it. I think it was Anne Frank who said that what's done cannot be undone, but you can stop it from happening again. That's where we are. This is the inflection point. And especially after the pandemic, all the inequities that you and I have been talking about, we've been canaries in the coal mine about, the pandemic laid bare all of those inequities and then exacerbated them. So we have to make sure that this recovery does not return us to an unjust status quo normal. And I do believe reparations should be a part of that. But I also believe canceling student debt should be a part of that. Restoring voting rights, abolishing the filibuster, passing my baby bonds bill, addressing the Black maternal mortality crisis, right? So it's not just one piece of legislation. Again, it's going to require us to have the political will, the courage, and the stamina to really meet the needs of people.
I'm hearing you talk about the needs of people, the power and dignity of people, and I'm imagining the storefront in the South Side of Chicago and your grandfather. And I so appreciated hearing about your mother and father and the influence they've had on who you are today and the tremendous leadership you're bringing to our country. I'm so grateful for that. I want to close by asking you, is hope a construct that you use? I've heard you say you're an eternal optimist, I think. Where does that sensibility come from for you in the face of everything that you see every day, in the face of what you saw on January 6th? What do you draw on to carry yourself forward in this work?
Obviously, my faith, the faith of a mustard seed. That is why I'm an eternal optimist. I believe in the capacity of humanity. I believe in the capacity of each of us individually to open our minds, our hearts, our arms, to change who we are at our very core. Hope. It is a practice. It is a discipline. And days after Donald Trump's election, I was in prayer and meditation with my husband, and we use this book, The President's Devotionals. I don't know if you're familiar with it, to guide us in it. But the devotional and the affirmation was entitled A Gentle Battle. And I wish that I could remember the scripture that grounded the writing that followed it. But ostensibly, this is what it says, is that every morning we awaken to a gentle battle. And we must decide if we will go in the direction of worry, of weariness, of indifference, or if we will go in the direction of joy, of peace, of equality, justice. Out of all the negotiations and decisions of our day, this gentle battle is the most important. As soldiers, in what direction will we march? How shall our minds be focused? So I revisit that every day, and I choose to win the gentle battle and to practice the discipline of hope over the ease of cynicism.
Oh, Congresswoman, thank you so much. And we see that battle, and we see the faith and the joy you are bringing to it in your work. We're so grateful for your leadership and your inspiration and the hope that you practice. And we're honored for a number of years. We've presented a Human Rights Award. UUSC has among our honorees are Linda Sarsour, Rinku Sen, and John Lewis. And we are very honored and thrilled.
I'm shaking my head because I can't believe that I would even be in the same verbal company.
Absolutely. We're
of these
very
pleased, thank you
to present you with this Human Rights Award for your work for human rights, for the dignity and power of all people that you are uplifting and fighting for every day. We're grateful to be in this movement with you and look forward to our ongoing relationship and ways that we can support you in your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please know that you all embolden me and you fortify me in this work. So thank you for pouring into me in this moment, and thank you for being my siblings in movement building and justice seeking, and thank you for the honor of this award.
Yeah, thank you. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.